In keeping with his idea that the progress of civilization shifts emphasis from cruel and vicious positive checks toward more reliance on moral virtues and preventive checks, Malthus begins his examples of positive checks in chapter 3 with what he calls the rudest state of mankind. He accepted the mainstream perspective of social evolutionary theory from his day, presenting a linear hierarchy of stages that human societies were assumed to follow. The first, most primitive stage was hunting and gathering, which had a very low and inefficient ability to provide for the material needs of life, especially food. Here, more than anywhere else, Malthus thought, we should observe the pressure of population on such limited resources. Here we definitely should be able to see checks operating to keep that pressure under control. But what kind of checks? Among Native Americans, at least some of whom still lived as hunter-gatherers at the time of Malthus, he saw two checks to population, both of them positive checks.
In all the account we have of them, and indeed of most other savage nations, the women are represented as much more completely in a state of slavery to men than the poor are to the rich in civilized countries. Add to these hardships of the women the constant war that prevails among savages, and the picture will not appear very free of the blot of misery.
In this first sermon he wrote on population, Malthus sometimes seems to reserve the category of vice for only those deviant individual acts that violate the normative standards of a particular society, calling slavery and war miseries instead because they were accepted social conventions in some populations. On the other hand, at the end of his third chapter, he refers to vicious customs with regard to treatment of women, and vicious means vice. He also says that causing war is a vice, even though the effects of war are misery. At any rate, whether we call them miseries or vices, these are positive checks. The next stage of civilization involves what Malthus calls nations of shepherds, people who have domesticated animals and keep herds and flocks of them for food. Though they had a bigger food supply than hunters, however, Malthus sees little room for thoughtful preventive checks in these pastoral societies. The pressure of population also doomed them to positive checks.
Set in motion by this all-powerful cause, clouds of barbarians seem to collect from all points of the northern hemisphere. Gathering fresh darkness and terror as they rolled on, the congregated bodies at length obscured the sun of Italy and sunk the whole world in universal night.
Not only does the power of population cause misery and positive checks, then, but for Malthus, the power of population among barbarians even explains the fall of Rome.
As fast as some were mown down by the scythe of war and famine, others rose in increased numbers to supply their place. Among these bold and improvident barbarians, population probably was but little checked from a fear of future difficulties. All conspired to raise a population which remained to be repressed afterwards by famine or war.
In his fourth chapter, Malthus finally gets to the agricultural societies of his day. Domestication of both plants and animals forces people to settle down and form permanent communities on the land, but at the same time also increases their food supply many times compared to pastoralists following their herds and flocks over the landscape. Malthus concludes from this that the populations of European countries when he wrote just before 1800 must have been much larger than in earlier centuries, even back to the time of the Greeks and Romans. Here he mentions with approval an article that was famous at the time, David Hume's treatise on the populousness of ancient nations. Hume was the first modern writer to argue that ancient writers drastically overstated the sizes of armies, the losses in battles, and the numbers of subjects of the ancient kings they served, usually in an effort to make those rulers look more impressive than they really were. Malthus cites Hume's work and agrees with this conclusion for the simple reason that Europe was growing more food in Malthus's day than in the age of Julius Caesar. But there is one thing about Hume's argument that he can't accept, the idea that a rapidly growing population must be a large one. This made no sense to him. If a population is growing rapidly, it must be because there's plenty of food, and that must mean there's plenty of room for more people. If people marry late and have few children, so the population hardly increases at all, Malthus infers that the country must be full and the population must be crowding up against the food supply. At this more advanced level of civilization, though, Malthus finally finds room for something besides positive checks to population. At least some people in Europe, he thought, might be practicing preventive checks.
An intimate view of the state of society in any one country in Europe will enable us to say that a foresight attending the rearing of families acts as a preventive check, and the actual distresses of some of the lower classes act as a positive check to the natural increase of population.
Malthus feels sure that a man can enjoy a higher standard of living, given any particular level of income, if he lives by himself without a family. This applies to well-off gentlemen and also to their servants. In his 5th chapter, he gives many descriptions of the kinds of situations that could motivate people to delay their marriages and families. Some of these motives are purely personal, individual ones, such as not being able to afford your previous lifestyle once you have a family, that seem very familiar among young adults today who continue to delay marriages and families for much the same reason. To these lifestyle questions, Malthus adds more serious uncertainties. If you might lose your job at any time, or if the fierce competition of the marketplace might destroy your business or leave a whole occupational group with nothing to do, you also have to worry about what might happen to your children, and this might give you second thoughts about even having those children in the first place. That is what Malthus means by a preventive check. Here in his 5th chapter, while he's illustrating how the preventive check works, he goes off on a side discussion and delivers a rant that is at least as famous as his idea about the relative powers of food and population to increase. He gets into the question of the poor laws in England, what we today would call welfare. Today, this includes government subsidies for everything from food and rent to medical care and cell phones. In Malthus's time, the picture was a little simpler. There were 2 ways to help the poor: by giving them money to buy food or by giving them the food itself. Malthus argues against the idea of giving money for food to the poorest people.
If I only give him money, supposing the produce of the country to remain the same, I give him a title to a larger share of that produce than formerly, which share he cannot receive without diminishing the share of others.
Today we call this effect price inflation. If people have more money to spend on food, but the amount of food remains the same, prices rise, and the extra money will not buy any more food than you could buy before. But Malthus also argued against just feeding poor people in soup kitchens. This part of his argument is what made Charles Dickens so upset that he put the words of Malthus into the mouth of his character Ebenezer Scrooge. Malthus thought that if the poor got more food, they would immediately have more babies and the problem would continue, only for a larger number of poor people.
To remedy the frequent distresses of the common people, the poor laws of England have been instituted, but it is to be feared that though they may have alleviated a little the intensity of individual misfortune, they have spread the general evil over a much larger surface.
This is one point at which the imagination of Malthus may have fallen short of its potential. His unshakable assumption seems to be that if poor people become less miserable, the only possible outcome will be that they immediately have more babies and breed up to the limits of the food supply again, making the original problem bigger instead of removing it. Yet earlier in the same chapter, he described the preventive check to the power of population as something practiced by better-off citizens in particular. We can see this problem in sharper focus if we look again at Charles Dickens and his Christmas Carol. At the end of the book, when Ebenezer Scrooge has seen the light and become a kindly, generous man, he adopts the Cratchit family with their numerous children. We can see that Tiny Tim will get proper medical care and quite possibly survive instead of becoming an example of a positive check to population. In fact, all the Cratchit children will have bright futures with Scrooge's help and support. So what will become of them? Will they all immediately marry at early ages and reproduce a legion of new large families, just like their parents? Will those children in turn do the same thing until most of them are sunken back into near poverty as when we found them at the start of the story? Or will the Cratchit children grow up and find a place in the middle class, where they worry about maintaining their lifestyles? Will they fear losing their status if they don't postpone their marriages and families until they can support them at a proper standard of living? Given the generosity of Mr. Scrooge, how will this story play out in the future, with positive checks or preventive checks to the power of population? For Malthus, the answer seems clear. He believed that the poor you shall always have with you. But it is something for you to think about as you read Malthus and reflect on his essay and the comparisons that he makes between different countries.